Story number 1. Echoes beneath the ice. Winter in Michigan is both majestic and merciless. The frozen expanse of Lake Superior transforms into a vast, silent kingdom of ice, where the beauty of snow-covered pines contrasts sharply with the biting cold that seeps into every crevice. In 1938, my friends and I, a group of avid fishermen, sought refuge from the relentless winter storms by spending a week on the frozen lake. Little did we know, our expedition would lead us to a discovery that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. I was Jack Thompson, a seasoned fisherman with a deep love for the solitude and challenge that the winter months on Lake Superior provided. My companions were Tom Harris, a burly man with a laugh as hearty as his fishing tales, Sam Mitchell, the quiet thinker of the group, and Eddie Brooks, whose enthusiasm was matched only by his lack of caution. Together, we had braved countless storms, but this winter promised to be different. We arrived at the lake's edge on a frigid December morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine ice. Our equipment was carefully laid out: fishing rods, ice augers, sleds laden with supplies, and a sturdy cabin we had rented from an old friend who swore it was the perfect spot for a winter retreat. The cabin stood solitary among the towering pines, its wooden exterior sturdy against the harsh elements. The first few days passed uneventfully. We set up our fishing holes, drilled through the thick ice, and spent hours in quiet companionship, the only sounds being the occasional crack of shifting ice and the distant call of a loon. Nights were spent huddled around the fireplace, sharing stories and enjoying the warmth that the cabin provided. The serenity of the frozen landscape was both calming and awe-inspiring, a reminder of nature's raw and unyielding power. On the third night, as we sat around the fire, a fierce storm began to brew. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and whipping the snow into blinding drifts. Tom, ever the optimist, suggested we move some of our supplies closer to the cabin to prepare for the worsening weather. Reluctantly, we agreed, bundling up and trudging through the deepening snow. As we worked, the storm intensified, the wind lashing against the cabin with a fury that made the windows rattle and the door creak ominously. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the snow-covered landscape in stark, fleeting flashes. Thunder followed, a deep rumble that echoed across the frozen lake. We retreated back to the cabin, our breaths visible in the frigid air, hearts pounding from the sudden exertion and the raw power of the storm. That night, as the storm raged outside, we were awakened by a series of strange sounds, faint, desperate cries that seemed to emanate from beneath the ice. At first, we dismissed them as the wind playing tricks on our minds, but the cries grew louder and more distinct, echoing through the cabin with an unmistakable anguish. "Did you guys hear that?" Sam whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Tom nodded, pulling his coat tighter around him. "Probably just the storm. Let it go." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. The cries continued, a haunting melody of despair that pierced the silence of the night, driven by a mix of curiosity and unease. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured out onto the porch, the cold air biting at my skin. The storm showed no signs of abating, the snow swirling in a frenzy that made it nearly impossible to see. I scanned the frozen lake, the flashlight beam cutting through the blinding whiteout. There was no one in sight, yet the cries persisted, echoing off the ice like a lost soul's plea for help. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the inexplicable sounds. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a faint, ghostly figure standing on the ice, just beyond the reach of the porch light. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the apparition. It was a man, his features distorted by the cold, his eyes wide with terror, and his mouth frozen in a silent scream. He seemed to be trying to reach out, his hands clawing at the air as if desperately seeking salvation from an unseen horror. "Jack!" Eddie's voice cracked through the tension. "What the hell is that?" I turned to see Eddie staring in the same direction, his face pale and his breath visible in the icy air. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to find out." Ignoring the other's protests, I grabbed my sled and headed out into the storm, determined to uncover the source of the cries. The snow was relentless, each step forward a struggle against the howling wind and the thickening blizzard. The footprints of our earlier trek were soon covered by fresh snow, erasing any trail of our journey. As I approached the frozen lake, the cries grew louder, more desperate. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the ice. I reached the edge of the lake, the cold seeping into my bones, and peered into the darkness beneath the surface. The ice was thick, but the sound seemed to come from the depths below, a haunting lament that resonated through the frozen water. Determined to investigate, I began drilling a hole through the ice, the sound of the auger cutting through the thick sheet of ice breaking the silence of the night. Minutes turned into hours as I worked, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Finally, I broke through to the other side, lowering the bucket into the dark waters below. As I lifted the bucket, my heart skipped a beat. It was empty, the cold water shimmering in the dim light. Confusion and fear welled up inside me. Where had the cries come from? Had I missed something? Just then, my flashlight caught a glimpse of movement beneath the ice. A shadowy figure flitting through the water, moving with unnatural speed and grace. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. Something was trapped beneath the frozen surface, something desperate to escape. I quickly hauled the bucket back up, shutting off the auger and pulling away from the edge of the lake. As I stood there, breathing heavily, the cries ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. The storm began to subside, the winds dying down as if acknowledging the presence of the trapped spirit. Returning to the cabin, I found my friends huddled together, their faces etched with fear. "What did you find?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't find anything," I replied, my voice shaky. "But whatever it was, is still out there, beneath the ice." The rest of the week passed uneventfully, the storm long gone and the snow beginning to melt, signaling the end of our winter retreat. As the ice thawed, we decided to leave, eager to return to the warmth and safety of civilization. Packing up our gear, we said our goodbyes to the frozen landscape that had both captivated and terrified us. Years have passed since that harrowing winter on Lake Superior, but the memory of those desperate cries and the shadowy figure beneath the ice remains vivid in my mind. We never did find out what or who was trapped beneath the frozen lake that night, but the experience left an indelible mark on all of us. The unanswered questions and the lingering fear serve as a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown, and the restless spirits that may be lurking just out of sight. Sometimes, on particularly cold nights, I find myself staring out the window, the snow falling gently outside, and I can almost hear the distant cries echoing across the lake. It's a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and that the wilderness holds secrets that defy explanation. If you ever find yourself driving through the remote areas of North Dakota in the dead of winter, heed the warnings of those who have come before you. Respect the power of the elements, and remember that in the vast, silent expanse of snow and ice, you are never truly alone. Story number 2. The Woman in the Blizzard. Winter in Montana is a force unlike any other. The vast expanses of snow-covered plains stretch endlessly, the silence broken only by the howling winds that sweep across the barren landscape. In 1925, amidst this unforgiving wilderness, my life took a turn that I could never have imagined, plunging me into a tale of mystery and sorrow that still haunts me to this day. I was James McAllister, a rugged trapper by trade, accustomed to the solitude and harsh conditions of the Montana frontier. My cabin, a modest wooden structure nestled between towering pines, was my sanctuary from the world, a place where I could immerse myself in the rhythms of nature and the demands of survival. The winter of 1925 was particularly brutal, with storms that seemed to rage without end, burying everything in thick, relentless snow. One frigid December evening, as I sat by the dwindling fire, the wind outside picked up, howling like a beast awakened from its slumber. The temperature had plummeted to record lows, and the snowstorm showed no signs of abating. I had just finished preparing my gear for another long day of trapping when a soft knock echoed through the cabin. Startled, I grabbed my lantern and cautiously approached the door, peering through the small window. There, standing amidst the swirling snow, was a woman. She was shrouded in a thick, fur-lined coat, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows over her features. Despite the storm, she seemed oddly calm, her presence both unnerving and strangely comforting. "Good evening," she greeted, her voice melodic yet tinged with an otherworldly sadness. "May I come in? The storm has taken its toll on me." Against my better judgment, driven by a mix of curiosity and empathy, I opened the door, allowing her to enter. She stepped inside, shaking off the snowflakes that clung to her coat. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm Eleanor." Eleanor settled into a chair near the fire, her demeanor graceful despite the harsh conditions outside. We spoke for hours, her stories painting vivid pictures of a life filled with love and loss. She spoke of a family lost to the very storm that now raged outside, her words carrying the weight of unspoken grief. As the night deepened, the storm's fury seemed to mirror the turmoil within her, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken emotions. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the heavy snowdrifts. Eleanor stood, her presence lingering like a shadow. "I must leave," she said softly, her eyes filled with a sorrow that words could not capture. "Thank you for your kindness." I nodded, feeling a profound sense of loss as she walked towards the door. "Stay safe," I called out, watching as she stepped back into the blinding snowstorm. Moments later, she vanished from sight, swallowed by the whiteout conditions that had first brought her to my door. Days turned into weeks, and life at the cabin returned to its usual rhythm. However, a lingering sense of melancholy hung in the air, as if Eleanor's presence had left an indelible mark on my soul. Then, as the snow began to melt and the harsh grip of winter loosened, I noticed something peculiar. A set of footprints leading from my cabin into the dense forest. Yet no trace of Eleanor remained. Intrigued and unsettled, I followed the trail one crisp morning, the remnants of the storm now giving way to the promise of spring. The footprints were small, delicate, unmistakably those of a child. They meandered through the trees, leading me deeper into the wilderness until they abruptly stopped at an old, forgotten grave marked with the name Eleanor Whitaker. A chill ran down my spine as I examined the tombstone, the name etched in weathered stone standing out against the backdrop of blooming wildflowers. According to local lore, Eleanor Whitaker had been a young mother who had perished in a tragic avalanche in 1924. A year before my encounter, her family's loss had left the community grieving, and her spirit was said to wander the snowy plains, forever searching for her lost loved ones. As I stood there, memories of our conversations flooded my mind, the sorrow in her eyes, the weight of her stories, and the inexplicable connection we had formed during that stormy night. It was as if her spirit had reached out to me, seeking solace and understanding in the vast loneliness of the Montana wilderness. Driven by a sense of duty and compassion, I decided to pay my respects. I lit a candle at Eleanor's grave, the flickering flame a small beacon of hope amidst the fading snow. "I'm sorry for your loss," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "May you find peace." That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of Eleanor's face haunted my dreams. She appeared before me, her eyes filled with the same sorrow I had seen in the waking world. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a gentle caress against my soul. You have given me peace. When I awoke, the cabin felt warmer. The oppressive melancholy lifted as if a heavy burden had been eased. The connection between us had been severed, but the bond we had shared lingered, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and understanding. Years have passed since that fateful winter, and the cabin on Pine Ridge still stands, a silent witness to the events that unfolded within its walls. The story of Eleanor Whitaker has become a part of local folklore, a tale of love, loss, and the restless spirits that linger in the snowy expanses of Montana. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right and the snow begins to fall, I catch a glimpse of a figure in the distance, an ethereal presence moving gracefully across the landscape. I smile, knowing that Eleanor has found her peace, her spirit finally free from the torment that had once bound her to the frozen plains. If you ever find yourself traversing the remote trails of Montana during the winter months, remember the story of Eleanor Whitaker. Respect the histories embedded in these silent landscapes. For some souls find solace only when their stories are heard and honored by those willing to listen. And should a storm ever force you to seek refuge in an unfamiliar cabin, open your heart to the tales of those who have walked these snowy paths before you, for their whispers carry the echoes of a love that transcends the boundaries of life and death. Story number 3. Whispers in the Snow. Winter in North Dakota is unforgiving. The vast expanses of snow-covered plains stretch endlessly, merging seamlessly with the horizon under a blanket of white silence. In 2002, I never imagined that a routine drive through these desolate landscapes would thrust me into a nightmare that blurred the lines between reality and the supernatural. I was returning from a late-night shift at the local factory, the road ahead illuminated only by the weak glow of my headlights cutting through the thick snowstorm. The radio was off, a deliberate choice to avoid the unsettling static that seemed to amplify the storm's fury. My truck's heater struggled against the biting cold, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the relentless flurries. About an hour into my journey, as fatigue settled into my bones, I decided to take a short break at a rest stop I rarely used. The area was sparsely populated, with only a few trucks parked along the roadside, their drivers likely seeking the same respite from the storm. I parked my truck, grabbed a warm cup of coffee from the dispenser, and stepped outside into the swirling snow. That's when I saw them, a pair of small, children's shoes half buried in the fresh snow, stark white against the otherwise unblemished field. My heart skipped a beat. In the middle of such a remote and barren landscape, finding children's shoes was both bizarre and chilling. I approached cautiously, the snow crunching under my boots, and examined the shoes more closely. They were simple, worn from use, and the tiny footprints leading away from them were fresh, leading deep into the nearby forest. Curiosity gnawed at me. Who would leave these shoes here? And why? Without warning, a gust of wind swept through the area, causing the footprints to swirl into the air before dissipating completely. It was as if the storm itself was erasing the evidence of their existence. I felt a shiver run down my spine but pressed on, unable to resist the urge to follow the mysterious trail. I trudged through the snow, the footprints guiding me deeper into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with snow, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The cold intensified, each breath forming a visible puff in the frigid air. My flashlight beam pierced the darkness, illuminating the path ahead, but offering little comfort against the oppressive silence. After what felt like hours, the footprints abruptly stopped. There was no sign of the shoes or the person who had been wearing them. Confusion and unease settled over me as I stood alone in the heart of the forest. The storm still raging around me, I considered turning back, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a nagging feeling that I wasn't meant to leave yet. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft, muffled crying echoing through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to locate the source of the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the howling wind, but unmistakable in its sorrow. I followed the sound, my footsteps silent against the thick blanket of snow, until I reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. The door hung ajar, swaying gently with the wind. The crying grew louder, more desperate, emanating from within the cabin. A sense of dread washed over me, but I couldn't turn away. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness, and stepped inside. The cabin was cold, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. My flashlight swept across the room, revealing remnants of a life long forgotten, broken furniture, faded photographs, and children's toys scattered across the floor. The crying seemed to come from the back of the cabin, leading me to a small, cluttered bedroom. There, in the corner, sat a rocking chair that moved gently back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting there. The crying ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me. I approached the chair cautiously, the beam of my flashlight revealing a faded photograph resting on the seat. It was a picture of a young girl, no older than 7, her eyes wide with fear and her mouth twisted into a silent scream. As I reached out to pick up the photo, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came in sharp gasps, and I felt an invisible force pressing against me from all sides. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing. The rocking chair began to move again, this time with greater intensity, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I dropped the photograph in terror, the sound echoing through the cabin. The crying resumed, louder and more anguished, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of despair. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, but it held firm, sealing me in the darkness. The crying grew louder, now accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from every direction. "Help us," they pleaded, their voices filled with sorrow and pain. "Find us." Desperate to escape, I turned back to the rocking chair, hoping to find some clue or explanation. As I approached, the air around me grew thick with a cold so intense it burned my skin. The chair stopped moving, and the room fell silent once more. But the feeling of being watched remained, a constant presence that made every nerve in my body scream with fear. Suddenly, the image in the photograph began to shimmer and distort, the girl's face twisting into a grotesque mask of terror. Her eyes seemed to bore into mine, her silent scream now a manifestation of the anguish that had plagued her spirit. I stumbled back, my mind racing to comprehend the impossible sight before me. In that moment, I understood the shoes, the footprints, the crying. It was all connected to the tragic loss of this young girl. The cabin had been her refuge during the storm, but something had gone horribly wrong. Her spirit, unable to find peace, was now trapped in this desolate place, forever reliving the horrors of that night. Determined to help her, I began to search the room for anything that might offer a way to release her spirit. My flashlight caught sight of an old, leather-bound journal lying beneath a broken dresser. With trembling hands, I picked it up and began to read, hoping to find answers. The journal belonged to Eleanor Whitaker, a mother who had lived in the cabin with her young daughter, Clara. Entries detailed their struggles during the harsh winter of 1873, the isolation, and the increasing fear as the storm raged on. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, a mother's anguish as she searched for her lost child amidst the unforgiving blizzard. As I read the heartbreaking words, the room began to change. The oppressive cold lifted slightly, and a sense of sadness mixed with hope filled the air. I knew what I had to do, to honor Eleanor's plea and help Clara find peace. I carefully placed the journal on the table and began to recite the final prayer written within its pages. My voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. The crying ceased, replaced by a gentle whisper that seemed to carry away the lingering sorrow. The rocking chair stopped moving, and the room felt lighter, the shadows retreating into the corners. As the last words of the prayer left my lips, the cabin fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted entirely. The door creaked open slowly, as if inviting me to leave. I didn't hesitate, backing out of the cabin and into the still storm. The footprints that had once led me into this nightmare were gone, replaced by a sense of closure that had been missing for over a century. Driving away from Pine Ridge Cemetery, the storm beginning to abate, I felt a profound sense of relief. The haunting cries and restless spirit of Clara Whitaker had finally found peace. Her story no longer trapped in the frozen wilderness. But the memory of that night lingered, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the restless souls that seek solace. Years later, I still think back to that winter night in North Dakota, the eerie cries that echoed through the snow, and the desperate plea of a mother searching for her lost child. Pine Ridge Cemetery remains a place of quiet beauty, but those who visit are unaware of the tragedy that unfolded within its bounds. If you ever find yourself wandering through the desolate snowfields of North Dakota, heed the silent whispers carried by the wind. Respect the histories embedded in these remote places, for some stories are etched into the very fabric of the land, waiting to be heard by those who dare to listen. And remember, amidst the beauty of the snow-covered wilderness, the echoes of the past can reach out, seeking peace and redemption in the hearts of the living. Story number 4. Whispers of Winter's Grief. Winter in Maine is a relentless force. The snow blankets the landscape in an unyielding embrace, muting sounds and transforming familiar sights into eerie, monochromatic vistas. When Sarah and I decided to leave behind the chaos of city life, seeking solace in the tranquility of nature, the old wooden house on Pine Ridge seemed like the perfect refuge. Little did we know, our sanctuary would become a prison of sorrow and unresolved anguish. The house stood alone at the edge of a dense pine forest, its weathered logs and sloping roof promising warmth against the biting cold. As we drove up the winding gravel path, the setting sun cast long shadows that danced eerily on the snow-covered ground. The air was crisp, each breath visible in the fading light. The charm of the place was undeniable. Large windows framed picturesque views of the surrounding wilderness, and a stone chimney hinted at cozy nights by the fire. Inside, the house was as charming as its exterior suggested. The living room featured a grand fireplace, its mantel adorned with antique trinkets and family photos that seemed to watch us with silent eyes. The bedrooms were spacious, each with its own unique character, and the kitchen was well equipped for any culinary adventure we might embark on. It was perfect until the nights began. The first few evenings passed without incident. We settled into a comfortable routine, enjoying the peaceful isolation and the beauty of winter's embrace. Sarah took to gardening, tending to the small greenhouse, while I delved into my research, compiling data for a book I had long dreamed of writing. Our children, Emma and Jack, reveled in the snow, building snowmen and sledding down the gentle slopes nearby. But as the nights grew longer and the snow deeper, an undercurrent of unease began to seep into our idyllic retreat. It started subtly, faint sounds that seemed out of place in the otherwise silent house. First, we dismissed them as the natural settling of an old building or the wind finding its way through the cracks. However, the sounds grew more persistent and unmistakable. The soft, heart-wrenching cries of a child echoing from the basement. One particularly frigid night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, Sarah and I were awakened by the unmistakable sound of crying. It was a piercing, sorrowful wail that seemed to emanate from deep within the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my phone to call out to Sarah. But the line was dead, another casualty of the winter storm that had enveloped us. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. She stirred beside me, her eyes wide and filled with concern. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, though my throat felt tight with anxiety. We exchanged a glance, the unspoken fear between us growing heavier with each passing moment. Gathering our courage, we decided to investigate, armed with flashlights and a determination to uncover the source of the haunting cries. Descending the creaky wooden stairs, The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The faint light from our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The cries grew louder, more desperate, guiding us deeper into the bowels of the house. At the far end of the basement, we discovered a small, forgotten room that appeared untouched by time. Dust-covered furniture and faded wallpaper hinted at a bygone era. But what truly caught our attention was an old, worn diary lying open on a table. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink smudged and fading. But one entry stood out clearly: December 12th, 1873. Today was the coldest night we've ever endured. Little Clara wandered outside, chasing snowflakes in the blinding storm. The wind carried her cries, but none could hear her over the howling gale. I fear something dark prowls these woods, something that takes without warning. If she is lost, please, someone find her and bring her back. Our hearts break with each passing moment. A chill ran down my spine as I read the heartbreaking words. It was a plea from a parent, desperate to find their lost child amidst the unforgiving winter. The realization that our house had a tragic history settled over us like the heavy snow outside. We were not alone here. Clara's spirit, restless and tormented, still lingered, trapped by the very cold that had claimed her life. Determined to bring peace to the grieving soul, we delved into the house's history. Conversations with local historians and old newspaper archives revealed the heartbreaking tale of the Whitaker family. In the winter of 1873, a devastating storm had swept through the region, claiming the lives of many, including young Clara Whitaker. Her disappearance had left the family shattered, their grief echoing through the years in the form of haunting cries and unexplained phenomena. As the snow began to melt, marking the end of our winter retreat, we decided to honor Clara's memory. We organized a small memorial service in the basement room where we had found her father's diary, lighting candles and placing flowers to guide her spirit to rest. The ceremony was simple yet filled with heartfelt emotion, our prayers a beacon of hope amidst the lingering sorrow. On the final night before our departure, the house felt different, lighter, as if the weight of Clara's grief had been lifted. The cries had ceased, replaced by a peaceful silence that filled the air with a sense of closure. As we packed our belongings and prepared to leave, we took one last look around the house, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to help a lost soul find peace. Driving away from Pine Ridge House, the snow-covered landscape receding in our rearview mirror, we knew that our time there had changed us forever. The haunting cries of the past had been silenced, replaced by the enduring memory of a family's love and loss. Winter in Maine had tested us in ways we could never have imagined, but it had also taught us the profound power of compassion and the importance of remembering those who had been lost to time. Years later, whenever a fierce winter storm blankets the landscape, I find myself reflecting on that unforgettable experience. The memory of Pine Ridge House and the lost child whose cries once echoed through the halls serves as a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the spirits that linger beyond. If you ever find yourself seeking solace in the remote corners of Maine, remember the story of Clara Whitaker. Respect the histories embedded in the places you inhabit. For some souls find their peace only when their stories are heard and honored by those willing to listen. Story number 5. The White Shadow of Colorado. Winter in Colorado is a time of breathtaking beauty and relentless cruelty. The snow-covered peaks glisten under the pale sunlight, and the vast expanses of white create an illusion of endless tranquility. But beneath this serene facade lies a darkness that only the most unfortunate souls encounter. This is the story of that darkness, a night that forever changed my perception of the wilderness. It was January 1997, and my friend Mark and I decided to embark on a winter road trip through the Rocky Mountains. We were both avid outdoor enthusiasts, always seeking the next adventure to satiate our hunger for exploration. Our plan was simple: drive from Denver to Estes Park, stopping along the way to enjoy the pristine beauty of the snow-covered landscapes. Little did we know, Our journey would lead us into a nightmare from which we might never escape. The first few days of our trip were everything we had hoped for. We marveled at the towering pines, hiked through untouched trails, and captured countless photographs of the majestic scenery. As we ventured deeper into the mountains, the roads became narrower and less maintained, weaving through dense forests and rugged terrain. The isolation was both exhilarating and unnerving, a reminder of nature's dominance over man. On the fourth day, a fierce snowstorm began to brew. The weather forecasts had been inconsistent, and we hadn't anticipated the severity of the approaching storm. By midday, the sky had darkened, and the first heavy flakes began to fall, quickly escalating into a blinding blizzard. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. We decided to seek shelter at a small, seemingly abandoned cabin we spotted along the roadside. The cabin was a relic from another era, its wooden exterior weathered and covered in snow. The windows were partially boarded up, and the door creaked ominously as we pushed it open. Inside, the space was sparse but provided the refuge we desperately needed. We set up our gear, huddled around a makeshift fire, and waited for the storm to pass. As the night deepened, the storm raged on, the howling wind penetrating every crevice of the cabin. Mark and I tried to distract ourselves, sharing stories and attempting to sleep, but the oppressive atmosphere made rest elusive. It was then that I first heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct, forming words that sent chills down my spine. "Follow us," it seemed to say, beckoning us beyond the confines of the cabin. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The whispers continued, guiding us towards the door, urging us to venture out into the storm. My rational mind screamed at me to stay, but a strange compulsion held me back. The idea of being lost in this storm, miles from civilization, was terrifying enough without adding supernatural elements into the mix. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the howling wind immediately biting at my face. The snow swirled around me, and the world was reduced to a blur of white. Mark followed, hesitant but unable to resist the pull of the unknown. We followed the direction of the whispers, navigating through the thickening snow with every step. After what felt like hours, we emerged from the dense forest onto a small clearing illuminated by the dim light of our flashlights. There, amidst the swirling snow, stood a figure, a white shadow, ethereal and otherworldly. It moved with a fluid grace, gliding effortlessly across the snow without leaving a single footprint in its wake. The shadow seemed to glow faintly, a beacon in the darkness that promised safety and direction. "Please," the whispers echoed, coming from all around us. "Follow us." Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances, the fear palpable in the frigid air. The shadow continued to lead us, his presence both mesmerizing and terrifying. We walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of our boots on the snow and the distant howling of the storm. The shadow moved with purpose, guiding us deeper into the wilderness, away from the safety of the cabin. As we followed, the landscape around us began to change. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The snow seemed to grow thicker, the storm intensifying as if we were being drawn into a vortex of darkness. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from pleading to commanding, urging us to keep moving forward. Hours passed, or so it seemed, as we navigated through the treacherous terrain. Exhaustion set in, our limbs numb from the cold, but the shadow showed no signs of stopping. We trudged on, driven by a mix of fear and an inexplicable sense of duty. The storm showed no signs of abating, the wind howling louder than ever, threatening to tear us apart. Just as I was about to give up, the shadow led us to the edge of a frozen lake. The surface was smooth and mirror-like, reflecting the pale light of our flashlights. In the center of the lake stood an old, decrepit bridge, its wooden planks barely holding together beneath the weight of the snow. The shadow paused, its form wavering as it turned to face us. "This is the way," the whispers commanded, their voices now a chorus of sorrow and despair. "Find the light." I looked at Mark, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. "We have to trust it," he said softly, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. With no other option, we approached the bridge, each step taking us closer to the unknown. The ice beneath our feet was treacherous, threatening to give way at any moment. The shadow remained beside us, a silent guide leading us towards the center of the lake. As we reached the middle of the bridge, a blinding light erupted from below the ice, illuminating the entire area with an intense, otherworldly glow. The shadow dissolved into the light, and the whispers ceased abruptly, leaving us in stunned silence. The light was both beautiful and horrifying, an overwhelming presence that seemed to press down on us from all sides. Suddenly, the ice beneath our feet began to crack and shatter, the sound echoing through the night like the breaking of 1,000 dreams. Panic surged through us as the ground gave way, plunging us into the freezing water below. The shock of the cold was immediate, sending waves of pain through my body as I struggled to break free from the icy grip of the lake. Mark fought alongside me, our hands grasping at anything solid as the water threatened to pull us under. The whispers returned, now a cacophony of voices filled with anguish and rage. "Stay with us," they cried. "Never leave." Desperation fueled our movements as we clawed our way back to the surface, gasping for air and fighting against the icy waters that sought to claim us. The bridge above began to collapse, the remnants of wood and ice falling into the depths below as we reached the edge. With a final, Herculean effort, we pulled ourselves onto the icy shore, collapsing onto the snow-covered ground, our bodies numb and our hearts racing. The storm began to subside, the wind dying down as if acknowledging our escape. We lay there for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the night enveloping us in its cold embrace. Slowly, we regained our strength, pulling ourselves to our feet and stumbling back towards the cabin. The shadow was gone, leaving us alone in the stillness of the aftermath. As we made our way back, the snow seemed to melt away, the path to the cabin now clear and inviting. We reached the safety of our temporary refuge, the warmth of the fire providing a stark contrast to the horrors we had just endured. Exhausted and shaken, we knew that what we had experienced was beyond our understanding, a glimpse into a realm where the living and the dead were irrevocably intertwined. In the days that followed, we attempted to return to normalcy, but the memory of that night lingered like a specter in our minds. We never spoke of the shadow or the bridge again, the fear of reliving the nightmare too great to bear. The footage from our trip showed nothing unusual, the recordings of the storm capturing only the sounds of nature. Yet, we knew the truth. Something had reached out to us from beyond, a haunting reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. Years later, I still find myself drawn back to that winter night, haunted by the memories of the shadow and the whispers that led us astray. The wilderness holds secrets that defy explanation, and some roads are better left untraveled. The white shadow of Colorado remains an enigma, a ghostly guide leading lost souls into the depths of the storm, forever trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. If you ever find yourself driving through the remote stretches of Colorado in the dead of winter, heed the warnings of those who have gone before you. The snow may seem endless and the roads clear, but the wilderness has a way of revealing its darkest secrets to those who dare to seek them. And remember, some shadows are not meant to be followed, for they lead to places where the cold never fades and the whispers of the lost echo through the night. Story number 6. Echoes of the Frozen Rest. Winter in Vermont is a season that transforms the landscape into a serene, almost otherworldly expanse. The snow blankets everything in pristine white, muffling sounds and creating an illusion of untouched purity. In the heart of this frozen paradise lies Pine Ridge Cemetery, a place steeped in history and, as recent events have proven, haunting mysteries. I had always been fascinated by Vermont's rich history and its many untold stories. As a cultural historian, my work often took me to forgotten corners of the state, unearthing tales that time had nearly erased. When I heard about the strange occurrences at Pine Ridge Cemetery during the harsh winter of 1873, my curiosity was piqued. Reports from local villagers spoke of eerie bell sounds emanating from the cemetery, despite no visible source. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the site and investigate these unsettling phenomena. The journey to Pine Ridge Cemetery was arduous. The roads were treacherous, covered in thick layers of ice and snow that made every mile a struggle. By the time I arrived, dusk had already settled, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cemetery was a sprawling expanse, its iron gates creaking ominously in the biting wind. As I approached, the air grew colder, the silence almost palpable, broken only by the distant howl of the wind through the trees. I set up my temporary research station near the old caretaker's cottage, a dilapidated structure that had long been abandoned. The cottage itself was a relic of a bygone era, with its wooden planks warped by years of exposure to the elements and windows cracked from the relentless winter storms. Inside, I found remnants of past inhabitants, rusted tools, faded photographs, and brittle documents that hinted at the cemetery's dark past. That night, as the temperature plummeted further, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of bells ringing in the distance. The chimes echoed through the cemetery, their mournful tones reverberating off the gravestones and silencing the night. I grabbed my lantern and ventured out into the snow-covered grounds, the cold biting at my skin and numbing my fingers. The source of the bells was elusive, seeming to shift and fade with each step I took. As I wandered deeper into the cemetery, the bells grew louder, guiding me towards an old mausoleum at the far end of the grounds. The structure was imposing, its stone facade weathered by time and covered in creeping ivy. The large iron doors were slightly ajar, allowing a faint glow from within to seep into the night. My heart raced as I approached, the sound of the bells now a haunting melody that seemed to beckon me closer. Inside the mausoleum, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying flowers. Rows of marble sarcophagi lined the walls, each one bearing the name of a long-deceased family. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface clouded with age. As I stepped closer, the bells ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I examined the mirror, noting the intricate carvings around its frame, symbols that seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. Suddenly, the surface of the mirror shimmered, and an image materialized before me. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her hands clawed at the glass as if trying to break free. Panic surged through me as I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven stone floor. The temperature dropped further, my breath visible in the frigid air. The woman's figure flickered, her form wavering like smoke in the wind. Desperate to understand what was happening, I reached out to touch the mirror, but my hand met only cold glass. Just then, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Whirling around, I saw a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, an elderly man dressed in worn hunting attire. His eyes were hollow, his expression vacant as he gazed at the mirror. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fear. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began to walk towards the exit, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the spectral image in the mirror. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved deeper into the cemetery's history. Local archives and old newspaper clippings revealed a tragic story. In the winter of 1873, a series of brutal storms had ravaged the area, claiming the lives of many villagers. Among the victims was Eleanor Whitaker, a young mother who lost her children in a devastating avalanche. Consumed by grief, Eleanor had turned to dark rituals, seeking to communicate with her lost children and bring them back. The townsfolk believed that her desperation had awakened restless spirits, forever bound to the cemetery in their frozen state. The scratching marks inside the disturbed coffins suggested a frantic attempt to escape, while the shattered graves indicated violent disturbances. It was clear that something malevolent had been unleashed, something that sought to break free from its icy prison. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the mausoleum, determined to find a way to appease the restless spirits. That night, under a full moon that cast an ethereal glow over the snow, I performed a cleansing ritual, using the symbols I had uncovered in Eleanor's journals. I arranged candles around the mirror, their flames flickering against the darkness, and began to chant the ancient incantations. My voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at me. As the ritual progressed, the atmosphere in the mausoleum shifted. The temperature rose slightly, the oppressive cold giving way to a palpable sense of hope. The image in the mirror began to change, Eleanor's face softening, her eyes no longer filled with terror but with a profound sadness. "Find peace," she whispered, her voice a gentle echo that resonated through the room. "Remember us." The candles burned brighter, their light merging with the glow from the mirror. The symbols on the frame pulsated, their energy intertwining with the incantations. The spirits within the mausoleum seemed to respond, their presence gradually diminishing as the ritual took hold. With a final, heartfelt chant, the mirror shattered, the glass exploding into 1,000 sparkling fragments that floated away like snowflakes in the wind. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the serene stillness of a peaceful night. The mausoleum stood quiet once more, the dark energy dissipated and the restless spirits finally finding the peace they had long sought. Exhausted but relieved, I left the cemetery, the snow gently falling around me as if nature itself was forgiving the transgressions of the past. The bells no longer rang, their mournful tones replaced by the soft whisper of the winter wind through the pines. In the months that followed, Pine Ridge Cemetery returned to its tranquil state, the tragic history no longer echoing through the silent grounds. The townsfolk spoke of a sense of closure, the weight of the past lifted by the cleansing ritual that had finally set the spirits free. Reflecting on the experience, I realized the profound impact of unresolved grief and the lengths to which individuals would go to find solace. Eleanor Whitaker's story was a poignant reminder of the fragile line between life and death, and the enduring power of love and loss that binds us beyond the physical realm. If you ever find yourself wandering through the snowy trails of Vermont, seeking the serenity of its winter landscapes, remember the echoes of the past that linger in places like Pine Ridge Cemetery. Respect the histories embedded in these hallowed grounds, for some stories are etched into the very fabric of the land, waiting to be heard and honored by those who dare to listen. Story number 7. Frozen Smile. Winter in Alaska is a season that tests the very limits of human endurance. The relentless cold, the biting winds, and the endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness create an unforgiving landscape. In 1959, a group of us, seasoned hunters accustomed to the harshest conditions, embarked on what we thought would be a routine expedition deep into the heart of the Alaskan wilderness. Little did we know, our journey would lead us to a discovery that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. I was the youngest among us, eager to prove myself in the unforgiving wilds. Our group consisted of Bill, the grizzled leader with decades of hunting experience; Tom, the quiet tracker whose instincts were unparalleled; Mike, the jovial one who kept our spirits high; and Joe, the reliable cook who could make a meal out of anything. Together, we ventured into the remote mountain ranges, seeking game and the solitude that only the wilderness could provide. The days were long and the nights even longer. We set up camp near a frozen lake, the ice shimmering under the pale winter sun. Our routine was simple: hunt during the day, rest by the fire at night, and prepare for the next day's trek. The isolation was both comforting and unnerving, each of us lost in our thoughts as the snow continued to fall. One particularly frigid evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, we gathered around the fire. The crackling flames provided warmth against the encroaching cold, and Mike regaled us with tales of his past hunts. Laughter echoed through the silent woods, a brief respite from the oppressive stillness. As midnight approached, the wind began to howl, rattling the tents and sending snow swirling into the air. Bill stood up, his weathered face serious. "We've got a good one tonight," he announced, his eyes scanning the darkened forest. "A large moose tracked just east of our camp. Tom, you take lead. Mike, you cover our backs. Joe and I will set up a perimeter." We split up, moving silently through the thick snow, our breaths visible in the frigid air. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim glow of our lanterns. Tom's footsteps were steady, his movements calculated as he followed the moose tracks. The cold seeped into our bones, but the thrill of the hunt kept us moving forward. Hours passed with no sign of the moose. Frustration began to set in as we trudged through the relentless snow. It was then that we stumbled upon something that would change our lives forever. Bill was the first to notice it, a figure lying motionless in the snow, partially buried under a mound of white. We approached cautiously, our weapons at the ready, but there was no sign of movement. As we drew closer, the sight that greeted us was both horrifying and inexplicable. It was a man, frozen in a strange, contorted pose. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the void, and his mouth was frozen in a grotesque smile. The expression on his face was one of sheer terror, yet his lips curled upwards in a chilling grin. Surrounding him were tracks that suggested he had been running desperately, fleeing from something unseen. "Jesus," Tom muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What in the hell happened here?" We circled the body, noting the lack of any visible wounds or signs of a struggle. The snow around him was undisturbed, except for the tracks leading away into the darkness. It was as if he had been chased by something that forced him into this final, frozen stance. Bill knelt beside the man, his hands trembling slightly. "He's been here a while," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "No signs of scavengers, either." Mike shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. "Whatever chased him, it left him like this. It's like he was fighting for his life against something beyond our understanding." We sat in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on us. The man remained motionless, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked in these remote parts of Alaska. As the night wore on, we took turns keeping watch, our minds haunted by the man's frozen smile and the mystery of his demise. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the landscape transformed. The sun shone brightly, casting glittering reflections on the ice-covered lake. Despite the beauty around us, there was no sense of relief. The man's lifeless form remained a constant presence in our minds, a symbol of the unknown forces that governed these wild lands. Days turned into weeks as we continued our hunting expedition, but the memory of the frozen man never left us. Each night, as we gathered around the fire, we spoke of him, trying to make sense of the inexplicable smile and the fear that had consumed him. We wondered if it was a manifestation of some supernatural entity, curse, or merely the madness induced by isolation and extreme conditions. One evening, as we prepared to retire to our tents, we heard it, the soft, mournful sound of a child's lullaby carried by the wind. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, yet filled with an underlying sense of sorrow. We exchanged uneasy glances, the familiar chill of fear settling in our bones. Bill stood up, his expression grim. "That's not the wind," he said, his voice low. "It's coming from the direction of the man's body. We need to check it out." Reluctantly, we followed the sound, our footsteps crunching in the snow as we made our way back to the frozen corpse. The lullaby grew louder, the notes weaving through the trees like a spectral whisper. As we approached, the melody seemed to emanate from the ground itself, drawing us into its melancholic embrace. Suddenly, the air grew icy, the temperature plummeting as if an unseen force had shifted. The man's eyes snapped open, filled with a terror that mirrored our own. His frozen smile twisted into a snarl, the grotesque expression now one of malevolence. The lullaby transformed into a haunting wail, echoing through the silent woods. "We need to leave," Tom urged, grabbing Bill's arm. "Now." But it was too late. The snow around us began to swirl violently, the ground trembling beneath our feet. Shadows danced at the edges of our vision, and an overwhelming sense of dread consumed us. The man's lifeless form began to move, his body contorting unnaturally as he rose from the snow, his eyes burning with an unholy light. "You can't leave," he hissed, his voice a chilling blend of anger and despair. "You're trapped here with me." Panic erupted within us as we turned to flee. But the path we had taken was now obscured by the swirling snow and shifting shadows. The forest seemed alive, each tree and rock conspiring to block our escape. We stumbled through the blinding storm, the man's laughter echoing in our ears, a constant reminder of the terror that pursued us. Hours passed in a blur of fear and desperation. The storm showed no signs of abating, the snow piling higher as we struggled to find our way back to camp. Exhausted and frostbitten, we finally emerged from the wilderness, the morning sun piercing through the remnants of the storm. But our ordeal was far from over. As we collapsed near the edge of the forest, the man's figure stood at the threshold, his grotesque smile a permanent scar on his face. "You're mine now," he declared, his voice resonating with an otherworldly power. We managed to stagger back to the camp, our bodies numb from the cold and our minds shattered by the night's horrors. The frozen man remained a haunting presence in our memories, a symbol of the darkness that could lie hidden in the most beautiful of places. We packed our gear and left Alaska shortly after, the echoes of that frozen smile lingering in our minds long after we returned to civilization. Years have passed since that fateful winter, but the memory of the frozen man and his eerie smile remains with me. I often find myself staring into the distance, the vast Alaskan wilderness stretching out before me, a reminder of the thin line between the natural and the supernatural. The man's smile serves as a warning, a testament to the unknown forces that govern these wild lands and the fragility of the human mind when faced with the incomprehensible. If you ever find yourself venturing into the remote corners of Alaska, heed our warning. Respect the wilderness and the mysteries it holds, for some smiles are frozen in time, waiting to trap those who dare to uncover their secrets.